blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers.
Cracking down on eco-terrorism and being followed closely by the state. For the second time in the week, a young immigrant child has died while in custody at the U.S.
I'm here to help protect the water for the future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Hey friends, I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal. My first impression of Ken Ward, honestly, was that he was in pain. I had maybe been at one or two other meetings with him before I really did form a decisive impression of him, but I remember sitting in a room full of people talking about a climate action that I think neither he nor I felt was particularly meaningful or effective, and seeing the legitimate suffering that he was experiencing, just thinking about how we were utterly failing to intervene in the ecological trajectory. And I remember really realizing at that particular moment that I had some kind of deep affinity for him as a person and deep affinity for him politically. And that's kind of a lot of what we're talking about today, is why some people have an experiential response to the ecological crisis of suffering and a desperate desire to intervene, and why so many other people, including people who are perfectly capable of acknowledging its scope and significance in some kind of explicit terms, don't really seem to feel much about it or to actually incorporate a response to it in any really meaningful sense into their politics at all. We're going to talk about how right-wing, liberal, and leftist politics all kind of seem to feature some form of disengagement from the ecological reality that we're experiencing. Ken and I have been on a number of adventures. The meeting in question that I just referred to was during the planning of a pretty significant multi-day blockade of the train tracks going to a refinery in Anacortes, Washington. And out of our frustration with that experience, we decided to shut down the pipelines transporting tar sands from Canada into the United States. That action, at the time anyway, was the only direct action against fossil fuels that actually affected the oil market, and it resulted in a litany of felony criminal charges in 4 different states, some of which are still being decided in court. Ken is still in the process. He's in his 3rd trial in Skagit County, Washington, for burglary and some other charges. And so if you want to know more about what he is doing in terms of pleading the necessity defense, pleading that the laws he broke were necessary to break to prevent the greater harm of climate change, check out the Shut It Down Climate Direct Action page on Facebook. Also, if you want to know more about his life and his path through whatever this thing is we call the environmental movement and the broader political landscape, there's a movie about him called The Reluctant Radical, which is, and I know that it would be somewhat obligatory to at least not say it's a bad movie since I'm interviewing him, but it's actually quite a good movie. It's not, as one friend put it after we saw it for the first time, it's not activist-y. It's not the typical framing of here's the serious problem, but if we unite and act now, hope is on the horizon. It's about somebody really struggling, the personal experience that somebody has of really not succeeding in intervening in the ecological trajectory and the emotional repercussions, the social repercussions, the professional impacts, the whole scope of the impacts that really coming to terms with that and experiencing it has for a person. I think it's a great film. So yeah, check out Shut It Down Climate Direct Action. Check out The Reluctant Radical. And then if you haven't already, go ahead and like Fight Like an Animal on Facebook. And I also did go ahead and make a Twitter profile, Fight Like an Animal Podcast. So check me out there if you are so inclined. Okay, well, thank you for taking time out of gardening to be here with me, Ken. I know it's actually really difficult on some level to stop gardening and to keep talking about politics. But I guess a lot of why I started making this podcast, a lot of like my fundamental intention is that I just did tons of organizing over the years, and I kept putting in a bunch of work into various projects and then getting to a point where I felt like some of the like really underlying assumptions, some of the like basic cultural models that people were operating out of, the basic like, I guess, psychological frameworks that people's politics were coming from were really different than mine, and also like I felt incompatible with our objectives in some way, that we weren't going to achieve our ostensible ends because of some like often unarticulated way that they were framing the entire political project. And so I have found in trying to talk to people who haven't like been on that particular organizing journey with me, I've found that it's often easier for me to convey some sense of like what I think is kind of fundamentally broken about how we're doing politics or whatever, not by meticulously describing all these different aspects of policy and organization, but by just like describing my own path, by saying like, well, I tried this and then we got to this point, so I gave up on that and started doing this instead. So I'm wondering if you can kind of like give us an overview of your trajectory personally through the landscape of environmental politics in general and climate politics in particular.
Sure. I'm actually well versed in that at the moment, and have practiced it because that's part of the defense of a climate necessity defense that
Right.
You were able to give once in Portland and are planning to give in Skagit County, is to walk through all the various things that I've done and tried. I prepared for that for previous trials, but I really worked on it for this one because of the necessity defense. So I actually ended up writing a short political history of my life and doing some interviews. Called my mom to say, hey, what was the first thing you remember me doing? Sort of politically or whatever. She was like a pause, and she goes, don't you remember running away to go to Earth Day? And the first one, I was like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. So I ran away from home to go to Earth Day in 1970. We didn't make it, but we tried.
Wait, how old were you?
I would have been 14.
Okay, all right. Well, that's
we had 9 of us got together and said we're going to meet up at school and run away to go try to catch a bus at the Brown or URI campus and go down to DC or New York. I don't remember which. So we failed to make it there, but that was memorable. So yes, I have that. And I also have had that same experience. For me, much of my political experience was having this sort of inchoate, sense of things being off, but not necessarily myself knowing what was off about it. It just, except in the particulars. So it would be a specific thing. It would be like, no, that clearly doesn't make sense to do. So, for example, one of the things I testified at was about being at a gathering that was organized by the Energy Foundation in San Francisco, somewhere in the 90s. It was organized by the Energy Foundation and NRDC, of local activists working on energy and consumer issues. And the purpose of it was to present to us this great idea that the states were all going to roll back utility regulation to deregulate the utilities but we were going to get this promise from the utility companies they would buy a certain amount of renewables. And I was sitting in this meeting, and I raised my hand and I said, well, especially in light of climate, at some point, aren't we even going to want to nationalize the utility? They go the opposite direction. We're going to need to nationalize them. And why would we do this thing? So that was one of those examples of just things would pop up where I go I don't feel like everyone's looking at the world in quite the same way. And they're also just not being politically astute. Or you're it seems pretty obvious. Or the whole idea that we had for, what was it, nearly 20 years, it was a prevailing view in mainstream U.S. environmentalism that the fossil fuel companies were going to voluntarily get out of the business of being the richest companies in the world in order to build solar. I mean, anyway, my actual trajectory was being interested in, concerned about environmental things in a general sense, at the beginning of the environmental movement, but also the tail end of the 60s. So it was a good time to be an environmental thinker. It was a terrible time to be a revolutionarily inclined person because you were surrounded by people whose revolution had just failed.
Right. And
they then controlled, for decades, well, I guess in some senses still do. They became academics and a bunch of other things, and they controlled the conversation. So it's very stifling. And I was not interested in being a doctrinaire leftist because there's no room for environmentalism of any sort in the left at that time. And I wasn't interested in being a liberal environmentalist either. I didn't really see how that could possibly get to the scale of change we needed. And I ended up going to some event in college where I listened to Ralph Nader talk, and he was just startlingly different. It was kind of result oriented and also much better about describing the general fix we're in. And so I got involved at the state level in PIRG, the state PIRGs, which was Nader based network. And then I did that for 20 years. Was the director of a number of organizations. I was part of a fairly small group of people starting in Massachusetts that were trying to take what had been just a bunch of individual state organizations and meld it into a national group, which we did, and also to expand off the campuses, which we did. And for quite some time, I thought that especially because as a group of people, and just primarily based on the leadership of Doug Phelps, who was the key lead person in the effort. But he brought to it, among other things, a perspective of the phrase we used for it was working under many different hats. There was the idea that one organization couldn't possibly do with the scale of change we needed. So one thing we could do is to create more than one organization to do different things in different settings. And the other was to do all of that work with the sense that we were doing this as cogs in some larger political thing that might not be there at the moment, but we and others would try to work towards it. So even if what we were doing day to day might seem to be just liberal environmentalism, as long as we had this more revolutionary perspective in our heads and in our organizing efforts, then we would, get there when the time ripened. But as I just keep rambling on here.
Please do, yeah. You're making many salient points. These are many of the frustrations that I'm struggling to articulate as well. You're essentially touching on all of them.
At the end of 20 years, I was serving as the executive director in New Jersey, where we had built up one of the largest and definitely one of the more effective state level efforts. We had at its peak, we had about 60 staff people and 6 or 7 offices, and we canvassed the entire state. And we had a pretty large staff, a range of experts. We had in one of the elections for governor, there's no initiative and there's only one statewide elected office in New Jersey. So it really it all comes down to the governor's race, like that defines the political. Mm-hmm. So at the peak of my work there, our work there, the race for governor was focused on two things. One was water pollution and toxics generally, and the other was auto insurance rates, and those were both our issues that we had defined. Right. Jim Florio, a great representative, was elected governor on those platforms, and we then immediately won. I think we won like 27 bills in the next year and a half, including the toughest clean water law in the U.S. So it was the peak about what you could accomplish here, and then almost instantly, just by spending a little more money, they didn't really spend a lot. We were just swamped. We were at the national level, and then increasingly at the state level, we were basically spending all of our time trying to defend these things. I had felt like in the process of winning something like the Clean Water Act in New Jersey, that we were able to present it in the broader environmental sense, because there's some great language in the Federal Clean Water Act that talks about the vision of what you're trying to do here. We're trying to, in fact, return the nation to a state where it's built into the federal law, or it used to be, where all of our waters are fishable and swim. Like that's what we could talk about it. And so I felt like when we won those things, we were in fact working towards the broader ecological perspective, And then when we got into a defensive thing, we found that wasn't the case. Like nobody really wanted to fight. We didn't have majority support. It's the first time I realized that it's possible to have apparent majority support for an ecological perspective on the world, but really when it comes down to it, you don't have that.
Right. That really is one of the particularly disorienting things about organizing around the ecological crisis now, is both you and I, from different echelons of the political landscape, both of us remember the phase when there was some sense in which we remember the phase of some actual policy progress being made. We remember the phase when there was some sense of kind of winning, and one could you had to put an optimistic spin on it, but one could imagine that we were on a trajectory towards greater and greater restructurings of our society. And, you were doing something that looked a lot like liberal environmentalism, but you understood that it took place in the context of a larger process that was ultimately kind of revolutionary. And I was doing something that looked more kind of overtly revolutionary, but totally relied on very close forms of collaboration with what kind of looked like liberal environmentalism. And we can both remember when there was a more cohesive kind of political program in the world, that where there was, a diversity of entities working towards broadly similar ends, towards a cumulative effect that, we could see an overall desirability of. And we were actually kind of winning on some fronts. And then I feel like it's been a solid, I guess I feel like that ended maybe at the end of the 90s or somewhere. I don't have a sharp delineation. Maybe it really started ending after 9/11. But I feel like it's just truly been decades since there's been any legit progress or any sense that we're even evolving towards a framework for victory.
Yeah. And I guess I think retrospectively, especially that there was just never as much investment in the general population, voting population, but even within advocates for a truly ecologically revolutionary, vision. I've been surprised about, in this latest go around about the Michael Moore supported, documentary. Sure. The sheer, of course, this population is, what are we talking about? That's what environmentalism is based on. There's too many human beings doing too much shit. Why would anybody think that was in any way a problematic thing to say? And I'm astounded by the number of people, including presumably presumed environmentalists, who are saying that that's not that's a racist thing, or I mean that you can't talk about that. I'm like, but that's what environment. I mean, go back to any of the basics. I mean, to me, E.F. Schumacher in particular was a kind of a formative, small, like the concept of small is beautiful, and Buddhist economics is, we have to look at in every way in which we're problematic, impact or destroying the conditions, as in Jim Hanson's words, destroying the conditions to make civilization possible. But partly we have to ask what is civilization, and it's the understanding that if we have different expectations that aren't material, among other things, you don't have as many people. You don't have the need to have as many people because things are safer. And so, like, the basic idea of environmentalism is, to me, offers, at multiple levels, offers these solutions to the fundamental problems of humanity. And we've just given all that up in order to argue for solar power. I mean, like, I haven't seen the movie. I feel like I now have to go see the movie because I've read
you gotta see
so many reviews, and I'm like going like, I already know, I agree with the concept of the thing, however badly they did it. I'm sure they did it.
Yeah, I guess they could have done a better job, but it is so depressing, the extent to which this is being, like, presented as, like these arguments that are essentially like, well, you can't say anything about population because there was this guy once who said something about population and he was a racist, so that means that you are, in fact, definitely advocating for race-based genocide. And, like the filmmakers themselves pointed out in an interview where they were like, we're just saying what, like, the UN has been saying, we're just reiterating the most basic like these tenets that are just grounded in, like, the most basic, principles of the physical world that we inhabit, that people have been churning out literature like, the limits to growth or whatever, that scientists and entities like international planning entities have been churning out literature about for decades. And so it feels like, rather than progressing towards an increasingly, like, ecological framework in our society, like, the degree of, like, backlash that film got just made me feel like we're farther away from anywhere we would need to be than we've literally ever been.
At some point, if you want to hear the rest of my quick history anyway, but at one point when I actually sat down to try to make the first time I ever, I never thought of myself as particularly good strategic level thinker. Like, it was just not anything I spent, like, I was just befuddled always about, and I appreciated it when I heard other people talk that would help me make sense to me. I always I thought my forte was at kind of a campaigns level. Go do this thing, get a bunch of people and go, have a really good fight. Maybe win, I don't know, but I'm really good at that. And I was just not wanting to spend any time trying to think, and I just got to a point where I didn't have any answers, and I tried. It took me 2 years. It was awful. I didn't enjoy it. But one conclusion out of all that was to say, we've got the opposition. We have our enemies, right? That's pretty self-evident who they are. Although at that time, I wrote a bunch of things about how I thought that the intermeshing of corporate money with fundamentalist Christianity was going to cause real problems for them even further down the line, which I felt prescient about that. But I said that the most immediate and probably overarching problem is internal, is the left and the liberals. I mean, basically neither vision from the left, neither the left nor the liberal, whether or not it's corporate liberal, you can divide liberals into corporate liberals and social liberals, but neither vision is ecologically based.
Right.
It's just, that's not, and it's just not going to fit. They're both efforts to take over fundamentalist environmentalism and meld it to their own. And that's what we're seeing. We've reached the point where there's no there anymore, and the handful of people that do express those things have been marginalized either they themselves are marginal characters, or just they have been marginalized to the point where they're not, or just quieter. Like, I feel like I need to go back and reread some of Bill McKibben's books, because he no longer is he's far more expressing straight leftist stuff than he is ecological based, but I don't think that's where he started. Anyway, I decided it wasn't what we were doing wasn't working. When I, at the tail end of the 90s, did a little bit of research and reading. For me, an absolutely formative book is SDSS by Kirkpatrick Sale, The History of SGS, which is no longer, unfortunately, in print, but it's just an amazing, just walking through that whole, and between that and Piven and Cloward's Poor People's Movements, those two books formed my perspective on how change happens. And I was just saying, well, the basic problem here is that we're not being disruptive anywhere, including Greenpeace. Nobody's being disruptive. So I decided that I should go try to figure out how to support that. I reached out to Greenpeace, and then I ended up being hired as the deputy executive director of Greenpeace US. They wanted me because the PIRGs were very effective at fundraising, and Greenpeace US was losing a lot of money. And I was there for a short, disastrous stint, in which I, among other things, we figured out they were losing many more millions of dollars a year than they thought they were losing. And I proposed, and a lot of the dynamics are visible now in Extinction Rebellion were happening then in Greenpeace, because there was a part of an international movement with Europeans having a different perspective, and Americans, especially American staff people who were much more wanting to do was when environmental racism was first being raised, and were wanting to remake Greenpeace to more directly see if we can address racism in America. And how would you do that still under a green, banner or perspective, or with green values or goals was tough. So I thought that Greenpeace ought to divest itself of almost all of its staff offices and go back to being an extremely small entity that would be doing direct action in the way that it used to do direct action. And ought to be starting it on, instead of being like roughly 21 to toxics to climate, it ought to be about 50-50. And that's not the direction anybody wanted to go in. So I left. I didn't know what to do. Felt like that was sort of a last gasp effort, a way to try to approach this in a way that in which I could still be employed, in a decent paying job. I was very well paid actually at that point. I went back to the PIRGs for a little bit, and that didn't work. It wasn't working before. It was even worse when I went back. Then I started cast about trying to figure out what to do. The only place I'd ever read anything that talked about these things usefully was in Christianity, in the kind of Christianity I was raised in, which was liberal Protestant, in which God was friendly and distant, and not non-judging. It was a very comfortable place. So I went to divinity school thinking, well, I'll just become a minister and figure out some way to do that there. Which was my plan. And then my then wife, Angela, got unexpectedly pregnant. We knew we wanted one of us to stay home for several years full time, and we flipped a coin, and I won, which gave me the right to choose whether I stayed home or not. And since she was employed and I wasn't, that seemed like an easy call.
Yeah, sure.
So I became an at-home dad for 3 or 4 years full time, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I had no idea. I'd never held a baby until Eli was handed to me. Literally, I was like, "How do you hold this thing?" Then then at the end of that time, I was trying to figure out what to do next. I applied for a whole bunch of jobs. Nobody hired me. I don't think it was because of my radical views on climate as much as that I was anybody, it's like I had been in senior leadership positions, paid a lot of money. And if I wasn't going to be hired into one of those, there's nothing to hire me to do. You don't want to hire. I wouldn't want to hire. It's just easier to hire somebody younger and cheaper. I tried a few other things. Did some labor work, and none of it made sense because at that point I had enough of an understanding of climate that I thought I need to be doing something. So then a couple of people wrote The Death of Environmentalism, appearing on the front page of the New York Times, and one of them was somebody I had trained in Green Corps. And I saw the responses, and I thought the responses were really awful. The basic premise of it was that U.S. environmentalism is doing nothing effective on climate change, given the scale, and then proposing, which I agreed with, then proposing a solution that I thought was exactly the wrong thing, which is to give up on environmentalism entirely and to recast the solution to climate as being this opportunity to remake America. What became,
which is a strategy that's largely been adopted.
Yeah, it was. Obama basically, they didn't agree with it, but I thought Obama took that on entirely.
Totally.
The New Green Deal is just an extension of that. That's essentially what we've been saying, which is essentially you don't have to worry about, environmental values can be solved if you just recycle or change your light bulbs. And then as a society and at the kind of industrial cap level of capital, we can just substitute what we're doing now, and nobody's life is going to be hugely, changed here. So I wrote a response to that said that, and also addressed a few other things, like the problem of the left and the problem of liberals. And I got a very good response to that. So we organized a group of people, which eventually was called the Bright Lines Network. It had about 200 people who were in some way involved, but it was really a core of maybe 30 people. And we had a series of meetings. And then based on that and based on a lot of work I did, which took 2 years, I wrote, or we developed an alternative, like this is what U.S. environmentalism should be doing. Some of it we put out publicly in a series I wrote for Grist. And I was expecting, at the very least, it would help prompt enough, some level of conversation about these things, and that we'd be able to raise a little bit of money to try out some of it. It was modeled on what the right wing did pretty effectively then, which is to have independent think tanks, action praxis places. You try stuff out and talk about it. And then I'd always been able to I'd raised millions of dollars for the other stuff we were doing. I didn't think this would be that hard. And then we didn't raise a dime. I didn't get zero interest, not one. I would think I was invited one place, which is Lois Gibbs' group invited me to meet with their board. But other than that, no interest, no conversation, no debate, no money, no nothing. And then, which was really debilitating and caused me to go into intense depression. That was where I first had to start reckoning with okay, I'm feeling differently than everybody else is. I feel like what everybody around me currently feels all the time. Like I feel we are in crisis. I feel like we are almost about to go down the, tubes. People are going to, a lot of people are going to die. Entire ecosystems are going to be wiped out. Yeah, at that time it looked like it was a ways off, but like the decisions we're making now, and I felt that daily, and nobody else felt that, or very few, and it was a really difficult way to live, to figure out how to live. Many of the people I know are not alive. They have died. They just died from substance abuse, other things that it was just too hard to, my feelings.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So since then, that was 15 years ago, I guess. I have just been taking parts of that Bright Lines scenario and trying to do them, sort of pick up something, do it, try another one. They've all worked in the sense of, like they've been successful efforts. But I've never raised any money, like if you wanted to reduce, at one point I would just like reduce all this down to what is it we're actually trying to do here? And I'm like, well, I think we're trying to get 1,000 people that are willing to take risk, including the risk of losing their current job, like might actually have to raise money by working somewhere else while we do this, and are willing to risk being in jail for a long time and maybe risk, death or disfigurement or something, who knows, but take heavy risks. And then a not too much bigger number of people who are willing to support us with money and legal and whatever, all that stuff we need and love. And a modicum of money, $1 million or $2 million.
Yeah.
That's what we need. If we had that, then we could do some interesting things in the U.S. And I feel like we've not come anywhere close to that. We still don't have that. Today, we don't have that. That's what you need to have some idea of being able to be a effective rabble rouser in a place as big as this. And one of those things, of course, was to go out after calling for other people to do it. I went out and did my own direct action, which was started with the lobster boat blockade, which is nothing more, as somebody's pointed out, than just a basic Greenpeace action done like they would have done it, right? And it worked pretty. It didn't work. I thought that an action like that would result in enough money and people to at least continue to do actions like that, but that didn't turn out. None of the actions I've engaged in have done that, have accomplished that. We've raised enough money to save our own asses, get through the trial and whatever. But I think most people who have any idea of the work I've done, it's because, well, you're a direct action person, and not really. That's one of the pieces that I think we need overall. But like you were talking about earlier, really it's got to be, it has to be conceived of as different people doing and different entities doing different things where they are. But because they're all working together, you can have, it's extremely difficult to have a big vision of change unless you have some concept of the resources and how that might all fit together and be doable. If all you're doing is doing one small thing in one small place, it's very hard to think big.
Which is literally, I feel like I've spent approximately 25% of my political career arguing for precisely this perspective, just trying, being in whatever political process and saying some version of, yeah, but we can think different things and have somewhat different objectives. And the question is there a cumulative effect? Is there, that we ultimately all desire? Because then maybe we could stop yelling at each other about not doing the exact same thing and we could get somewhere. And it's astonishing how much that feels like. To me, that feels like an absolute square one organizing principle. And it is one of the many respects in which I feel like most of my political life I have failed to get to square one. And then, of course, funding is another one, and because the amounts of money you're talking about are a tiny proportion of the money that's thrown at liberal environmentalism. It's just a tiny, tiny proportion of money that is there for ostensibly for political change. But there are these incredibly tight parameters on what kinds of approaches you can be taking to get, literally any money at all, any money.
Yeah, and I don't understand I don't have a real idea of why it is that people want to distinguish what they're doing from what others are, rather than find ways that you would understand it to be common ground.
Right.
The key difference, to me, the differences are the liberals, it's all about policy, what policy is the right one, and then leftists, it's all about political language.
Right.
It's not really about,
it's like a framing exercise.
Yeah, it's like if you actually want to have a different organization, that if you're an all-white organization, you want to have an organization that's not all white, there's useful conversations that you could have about different ways that might be approached.
Do that, right?
Yeah, and there are people that have done that, and there's been downsides to that. It's tough. I mean, so like you'd want to have a reasonable conversation, but that isn't the case. There's no room to have that because there's an orthodox understanding of what that means now. At this point, as far as I can see, that's all been reduced down to unless everyone's own individual racism is exercised or changed, like that's the only litmus test, and everything flows from that. Ignoring whole very large things like how do people want to congregate?
Right.
Like people choose in areas where you get to see, like churches are the perfect example, where there are churches that are fully integrated. They're generally small and they really, really work hard at it. You have to find people that are going, yes, that's what I'm going to do. I want to be in a church like the one Paul was writing to,
sure.
But if you want to do it, so anyway, but people are not sitting around going, no. At this point, we need to find ways in which we could say, this is how we are. In fact, this is the thing that binds us. And at least originally, when I started off way back when, that would have been a common understanding of environmental values and an ecological perspective, and everything flows from that. And I do think the core of people who have that has gone up. I know because we've talked about this before. To me, the key metric has always been, what's the number of people who respond to an open-ended polling question that's something along the lines of, what do you think the biggest problem facing the nation, the country, whatever. So for all of the time I've been monitoring that, the number of people entering any environmental thing, including climate, has never gone above the margin, the 2% margin of error in any national poll, except in the last year.
Yep.
It's gone up. There's a 3 and a 5%, which is encouraging.
Yep.
Although I'd like to see the next one because it probably sunk back down below 2%. But that basic understanding of like, okay, you don't have 70% support or 55% or whatever poll you're showing for a specific policy.
Yeah.
What we have is less than 2%. That's what we need to work with. We need to have an organizing model and a political perspective that says we have a very small core to begin with. And so one thing you need to do is nurture that group. And everything we've done has run counter to that for decades now. It's like we're going to not tell the truth as those people understand it, because that will alienate everybody else. We're going to dumb down the truth, and we're going to do things like celebrate very small victories, which just doesn't resonate with somebody that has an ecological perspective.
So there was the lobster boat blockade, and then...
Yeah, I did that. I was astounded that we didn't... I'm sorry?
What year was that again?
2013.
Okay.
I believe. I was astounded that we thought we were going to be in federal, we thought it was going to be like plowshares.
Right.
Kind of thing. We'd spend a year or so in federal. So I was amazed that didn't happen. And then, and also amazed that it didn't result in ongoing such efforts. I moved out here from Massachusetts to Oregon for personal reasons, and then just sort of met you and others just going to meetings to figure out what's happening out there, and did Break Free, which had initially huge promise, and then got negotiated down to not quite so much. And then at the tail end of which you raised the hey, there's this thing they're doing in Canada. What's about doing that? So we did later in the summer.
So we did.
That was shut it down, and which is still playing out. I'm supposed to go to trial for a third time, having won. I had a hung jury on all counts of the first trial. It was retried again. Was convicted on one count. I appealed that because I wasn't allowed to offer a climate necessity defense where I could argue that I did it for these reasons, and it was justified. I won that in a very great opinion, and we were scheduled to go do that first in February, then in May, and now with the pandemic, we actually have a trial scheduling conference in middle of July.
Okay.
I'll be very surprised. I don't know how the criminal courts are dealing with this, but it doesn't seem possible for in any way to do this safely unless it's entirely by video. Like maybe that's the evolution could be. Right. Like my sweetheart is a medical doctor and a medical director for a group of clinics who's have a lot of migrant farm workers in Oregon, and they're having to try to figure out how to do most of their routine things all through video, which they figured out how to do in very short order. And it might be that the courts will end up doing that as well.
And so now you, like myself, find yourself gardening more than you used to.
Yeah.
Because the political trajectory just hasn't played out in a way that feels worth putting in the 16-hour days over anymore.
Yeah, I got very excited about Extinction Rebellion when it happened in the UK.
Right.
I saw it. I actually paid attention to the first or nearly first action they did because they went in and sat in at Greenpeace. I was like, oh yeah, who are these people? This is great. And I read their stuff, and they had good description of the problem. I didn't understand, and I think I probably now do understand. I'm not sure I wholly agree with the platform and the approach, but it does incorporate some things that we're talking about. It does have a fundamental ecological perspective and is clear about that. It's clear about the scale and speed of the problem and the necessary speed and scale of a response. It's clear, it's very committed to not trying to advance a small solution, but to force a communal response. Then it's a little tricky because it's in the business of simultaneously rebelling against government and calling on government to do certain things and not others. And it's also invested in this process of citizen assemblies, which we haven't seen a lot of experience with in the world. It's not entirely clear
what effect it would ultimately have.
Whether that will work.
Right.
I don't see why a government couldn't ignore a citizen assembly response as easily as it does its own bureaucrats. But at every other level up to that, and just the mere fact of the success that they accomplished in a very short period of time in the UK, I got very excited about that. I have had a trying experience with within the effort to organize it in the U.S., the first effort. I was on the very first couple of calls, and it ended up with some fundamental disagreements with the people who are now running it. Mm-hmm. There is an effort that I have supported to launch more of back to basics, to try it again in the U.S., much more closely following the model that was applied in the UK to see if that would work, because we haven't really tried that. I don't know that it will. The U.S. is so different, and the polarization is so great that it's not clear that there's room for it, but it ought to be tried. And it is one of the other places that's doing effective disruption. I mean, if the core of any of these things has got to be some form of effective disruption, the things that you and I have engaged in, which is more of a Greenpeace or forest type, actions that do require smaller numbers of people engaging in high risk. That hasn't taken off yet. So maybe it is time to try lower risk, larger mass actions that can disrupt by being in capital cities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's so interesting. Like, I find myself wondering what current me would tell me, I don't know, like 5 years ago about the current phase of climate politics, because I do feel like on some level there's been some qualitative shifts of sorts, like something is happening, but it's extremely difficult for me to characterize. I mean, I think that I hadn't actually seen the polling that you're referring to where more than the margin of error of people are putting environmental issues as like a primary concern. But I do know that in the polling where they just ask, I think it's some categorical question like, is climate change a major concern to you or something like that? I know that response rate was very was just like literally a flat line basically for decades, from the time of whenever, say like Jim Hansen's initial testimony to Congress or the first climate summit in Rio or whatever, pretty much stayed exactly the same as these like increasingly dire warnings came out, and it became increasingly clear that we weren't talking about something that was going to happen in a century. We were actually talking about something we were witnessing right now. And then in 2017, I felt like I noticed on like a totally subjective level, just in interacting with people, that was that first year that there was smoke choking the skies of like many major cities on the West Coast. And then there was simultaneously just like the Southeast was just, and the East Coast were just like inundated with hurricanes. And that was the first time in my understanding that same opinion polling that had been conducted forever found any substantial increase in the number of people who were saying that they were very concerned with climate change. And I did feel like kind of right around then, some of the things that that both you and I had spent so long just kind of, like hypothesizing about and wondering when we would ever see them, some like highly diminished version of those things did start happening. I think like XR in particular is an example of that. But I found, XR met some of the criteria of what I was hoping would happen, and that I felt like I spent a lot of time trying to create, in the sense that, like you said, it was like, it was truly a mass movement that did have like a pretty explicitly ecological framework on some level. And at the same time, I found that one of my core responses to it was this notion that I developed a lot earlier, that whatever you try to do, you should expect to achieve something like 2 or 3 degrees below it, right? And so like if you start an organization whose stated purpose is to, I don't know, create some symbolic mass actions, then what you'll actually end up being is like a support network for local groups who are doing little actions, right? If you say that you're going to disrupt infrastructure, then you end up being like XR, and you end up just like mass mobilizing. You end up having a bunch of symbolic mass mobilizations that are relatively low risk. And then you have to be like, well, I'm going for fire and bloodshed in order to get to the level where you disrupt infrastructure. And I don't know, I feel like if we were going to win, we would have to have a program for like a completely absurd utopia where, like a council of like elk, bears, and humans decided ecological policy through a magical form of communication or whatever, and then maybe we'd actually get like structural changes within, All
right, well, let me know when you get that worked out. I'll sign up for that. Although I have to say that years and years ago, like growing up in New England, I was like, I want to see a moose. I never saw a moose. And I thought, I'm going to go find a moose. It's in New England. I did trips of Maine. I never saw a moose. Never once. And I've been out here and I'm like, okay, I'd like to see an elk.
Oh, you haven't seen an elk yet?
I put out some kind of pheromone that sends larger mammals away.
If you go, they're tough to see around the Cascades, but if you go to the coast, I don't know if you tried that out, you'll often see them.
Okay. I'll give it a shot. But I mean, I was living good ways up Larch Mountain in an elk herd. And people would show up at the house saying, God damn it, they're sleeping on the road again. And I'd be like, what the? Never once. Anyway. I'm not sure I had that same sense of having to shoot higher. But also just I think I'm mostly shorn of the impulses and, perspectives or sense of how things work that developed inside a very vibrant network of people that had the resources to try stuff out.
Right.
And it had just a disciplined group of people willing to do things under this rubric of we're just going to try different things. So I know that once I've gotten to the outside and the kinds of places where we met, where money is not ever even thought about. Yeah, it's not like I'll sit in meetings and go like, geez, if we had $20,000, this very conversation that we're having right now would be very different if you had $20,000 to spend.
Right.
This constriction of poverty. I mean, $20,000 in the scale of trying to save the world when we're spending billions on that is nothing.
Right. But once you get into the direct action landscape, it's essentially just taken for granted that we'll have literally no budget, and that we'll raise some money to get people out of jail, and that's about the extent of the fundraising.
And it's not unrealistic, right? Exactly. Like there aren't that many places to raise money beforehand. Once you've done it, but then there's also no ability or capacity to go, well, we're not just organizing one action here or one little, like we're trying to end up with 1,000 people doing this in a disciplined way. I can't speak to the 350s of the world, but certainly in the work that we're doing, we never ended up with enough to really get to that next. A while back, somebody had sent out a thing from the Break Free saying, well, we've got this money left over in our fund, so we're going to, here's the 3 or 4 deserving organizations we're thinking about giving it to. And I wrote back saying, why aren't we doing Break Free again? That's enough to do it. We'll just do it again. I mean, shouldn't we be constantly doing, nobody even actually responded to that. It was seen as being, okay, we'll just do it once. And
yeah, that was one of there were many, like you were saying, it seemed like it had so much potential and it was pretty deflating, but that was one of the core, like, just fundamental departures that I had from, I think, pretty much everybody else, I guess maybe other than you, that we were organizing with, was I thought that we didn't do nearly what we had the potential to do, but then I thought we did mobilize a bunch of people and have a very clear capacity to keep doing exactly what we were doing, and I was astonished by the extent to which all the other core organizers just didn't really seem to think that was a compelling prospect, and we're kind of like, no, we did the thing, the video's on the internet, let's call this a day or whatever. And I was just like, but yeah, so I think I don't know, like a lot of what I'm focusing on as I'm going through this podcast series, like I've been, doing a bunch of stuff where I talk about research into, like cognitive differences between people that map to different ideological outlooks and whatnot. And I think that what you mentioned before, there's this key point, that you kind of mentioned or, hinted at before, where, like, sure, you do an opinion poll. They talk about this in The Death of Environmentalism, for instance. You do an opinion poll and you're like, do you support protecting national forests from logging or whatever, do you support significant climate policies? You're going to get some, like, fairly significant majority of people saying, yeah, sure, like, you'll get, like, somewhere up to about 75% of people will be like, yeah, that sounds great. But then if you reframe it to be like, what really matters to you, you get like a margin of error proportion of the population. You get like 1 or 2% of the population saying that they really care. And so much, like, as environmentalism has become subsumed by leftism and liberalism, and so much of the strategy is predicated on this notion. I mean, I think that leftism in particular has this real core aversion in a lot of its manifestations to talking about ways that people are just actually different, ways that there are some innate differences between people. And so that ends up having this consequence where it's assumed that everybody is more or less equipotential to respond to the same narratives in the same way. So, and if that were true, then that leftist strategy would make a lot more sense. Like, sure, let's just recruit a massive coalition. Let's just convert virtually everybody into like some form of the advocacy that we see as desirable. But it's just like, it's not the empirical reality. Like, doing the organizing, we just find that that's not true. And I think that, or you can look at opinion polling and kind of have a more theoretical spin on it. But once again, it all kind of indicates that there's some set of like, I don't know, I really don't have like a solid sense of like what it is. Like, I don't have it mapped out, but it seems like there's some set of perceptual tendencies, that there's like a certain type of person who is a lot more likely to come to an environmental, like an ecological worldview per se. And I can remember, we've talked about like the moment that we both like realized in our respective lives that we kind of like were environmentalists. And for me, that was very much like, it was very decisive, right? It really wasn't based on an understanding of the consequences for human society that were going to occur from continuing on the path we were on. It was this sense of, I mean, I've often thought of it as like a sense of increasing, like, identification with increasingly large scales of the world around me. So like at some point in my teens, I started really identifying with other people and wanting to intervene in their suffering. And then later on, I started to like identify with the entire world, essentially. And, but I feel like, I guess my question ultimately is just like, what do you think distinguishes people? Because it seems like there's something. What do you think ultimately distinguishes people who develop an ecological worldview as opposed to those who don't? Including those who don't, who are like in some sense involved in climate politics or...
Yeah. I should apologize for not having read your paper yet.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I've been actually literally trying not to think about any of this for a while. It's been a marvelous vacation because I can't do anything. So therefore I don't have to feel bad about doing anything. But I will read it. You can talk about that later. But those questions I feel are quite central because the way it came up for me, or the way I started asking about that is, so why is it that presented with this set of information,
right,
very few people are responding to it, including environmentalists, like people who are literally working in the groups.
In environmental
They're not getting up in the morning going, like what, why not? It seems I am. I mean, and some people, what's the difference? Is it just our training, and I think that, just stepping one aside, the current polarization in the U.S. makes this conversation difficult,
right,
because it swamps the differences. That we're in an us then situation,
and sides,
that takes over these other. But prior or alongside that, and I think I know you've heard this from me before, but I just ended up gravitating to these more educational psychology perspective of trying to understand, who we're teaching and how do we teach. And so things from that, and also from not so much the academics, but the sort of advocates within the disability movement, especially mental health disability movement, but just broadly. In those two places, I found people who were thinking about it as, oh, okay, we're not all the same, right? Are there ways that we could, in the way that humans do, usefully sort the differences?
Right.
Like, are there discernible things? And the answer in the educational area was increasingly yes. In fact, there are some discernible ways of being human. Well, they talked about it as intelligence. It's Howard Gardner's and kinds of intelligence. But it's as much who you are, and if you read through the different kinds of intelligence, it just makes sense. I mean, there's like some people who have skills of empathy, just ability to understand where the perspective of other people. They're just really good at that. And there's other people who, like our president, who are at the other extreme of not being, they don't get that, but they have some other facility. It fits into the story we're told is because of capitalism, but also other factors, is very much like there's a good way to be, and there's a fucked up way to be.
Yeah,
Where are you on the scale?
Right.
It's much more reasonable, accurate, fair, whatever to think of it as. Well, we kind of evolved to be, in groups, and it was really useful. If you're in a small group of 50 to 75 people, it's useful to have different kinds of people in that group and to be, so anyway, within those types of intelligence, there was this one that Gardner and his folks at Harvard, and in Gardner's work, they were trying to find types of intelligence that you could describe that could be, that would be identifiable in clinical laboratory settings, so that other people searching for these things could find them, and that's their, So one of the things that they identified, which I think is still listed as a candidate intelligence, but may have been actually, is existential thinking.
Right.
So, people presented with a story or information, presented with something, will tend to go to what's the biggest picture questions involved in that thing. And that, to me, perfectly explains people like you. Like there's just in most of human history, those kinds of people have tended to be mystics or go towards religion.
Yeah, totally.
In those terms. And that, because of that, people like Gardner, I think it's one of the reasons why they didn't embrace it as a full intelligence, because they think of it in religious terms. But I think that's our situation. I think it makes sense that you wouldn't, in a small group of people, want to have a lot of existential thinkers.
Right.
Because we don't do a lot of work. We'd be the ones who would be mostly inclined to go like, well, wait a minute. Before we do that thing that we're just going to go do, what about this? Or should we think about the following? And it's good to have a small number of those people, but you don't want a lot of them. I feel like that's at the individual level, presented with ecological perspective. There are some people who respond to that by going, like me and you, well, shit, that makes sense. Boom, as a whole worldview, all of a sudden, quickly, like, no,
exactly.
That makes total sense. There are also some people that may not be existential thinkers, I don't know that it appears in Gardner's list, but have an empathetic connection with nature. Sometimes it's with individual, like the pet lover, the dog lover types, but sometimes for me, I can feel, or like, our friend Emily Johnson, fellow Val Turner and poet, writes amazing poetry that's based on her sense of pain and anguish over what happens to a whole species.
Right.
Like, there's a certain number of people that have that pain. If you're on the right wing now, and there are definitely, I've met ranchers on plains and so forth, the people who just have that, they talk about it as love of the land or their languages, but their feelings are the same. And their sense of, distress at how the things are changing is there. They can't say anything about it anymore. So it's not possible, but it's still there. those are the people I feel like are, our core, and that any kind of fundamental change is brought about by a very small group of people saying we have to fundamentally do these things differently.
Right.
And that's our challenge, is we're trying to do that in pretty not enough time. But that's the, and then there's a bunch of other people who might support that, or they think it's a good idea, but it's not how their brains are wired. They don't get up in the morning feeling pain at the loss of these things.
Yeah.
That number is getting bigger. And when we were writing the Bright Lines thing, one of the big disagreements was, well, like there were I'd call us the realists rather than the pessimists, just saying like, realistically, none of this is going to change until we start seeing some impacts that are big enough. And it'll probably be too late, but we ought to think about it in those terms. We're trying to build a small group of people who are coherent and have a solution that we will say, this is what we need to be doing at that point of crisis. We thought it was hundreds of years off, but it's actually only decades or maybe years off. But most people aren't even going to think about it until the last minute.
Which is, once again, one of those ways in which the right seems to have like a strategic paradigm that I kind of wish other echelons of politics could adopt, where they do take people who are kind of like marginal, highly dedicated, somewhat extremist thinkers, and they're like, here's some money, try to influence the world. And, and again, it's like we were talking about, they're not trying to build mass movements. They're trying to totally shape, they're trying to shape politics from among relatively small cohorts.
That is, I do try to be empathetic to understand how people, who they are and where they are, constrains their ability to do things. But and therefore also to try to reduce my own anger. But I still am like, we're sitting here, we watch the right wing do this methodically, carefully. They went from being the John Birch Society, the most fucking loony people, they just methodically built from the John Birch Society to owning the whole country without ever winning a real majority of anybody for any of this. We know exactly what they did. Why don't we do something? Why don't we learn from this? Why, in some way, don't we say that works and we're losing? Let's try that. We're spending more money than they are. They did it with less money. I am so pissed at the people that just, I don't want to, I don't even know the answer. I don't want to do that because I like my job. I mean, that's some of it, but.
Yeah, no, it's definitely right. Like in moments where I'm beside myself by frustration, I'll find myself screaming something like, I'm not asking us to be geniuses. I'm asking us to be as coherent and smart as the lunatic motherfuckers on the right. Like, it's not asking a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I didn't know that research, where, there's like an existential intelligence that they kind of map to mysticism, but I think that I've definitely come to that conclusion, like when in the like very decisive singular moment when I was 16 years old, when I realized so much about what, realized that my life would kind of be preoccupied with what it's been preoccupied with, where I was like, I am deeply interested in evolutionary biology, I am an environmentalist, like everything is connected, like it was definitely like I can articulate all these conclusions that I rapidly came to, in pretty like straightforward political terms or whatever. Like I realized that our civilization is killing the planet. Like that's easy enough to convey, and it's a scientific statement. But I was also totally aware that the actual subjective experience I was having was in a different culture would have been, like I would have framed it as like a mystical encounter with something, it was definitely, it had that like the meta narrative, whether you're reading like the Thunder Perfect Mind or Black Elk Speaks or whatever, of identifying with everything simultaneously and feeling, like, or that people just describe whenever they take psychedelic drugs, I guess, where it's like, like I felt like I was all things and saw from all perspectives or whatever. And I thought it was interesting. Did you read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything?
Yeah.
I thought it was a really good book about climate, but, like on so many levels, like I thought it was smart. I thought it proposed some good policies and everything. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting about it was I felt like it was somebody who's really like fundamentally not grounded in an ecological worldview, actually talking about that and talking about how hard it was, like how imminent of a threat to all human well-being climate change and the ecological crisis overall had to become before she could pay like any attention to it at all. And Naomi Klein is a whole lot smarter and more focused and sophisticated than like most people who are, in her like broad kind of like left political echelon. But she really describes how there were like some legitimate cognitive barriers to her like deciding to give a fuck about the planet on some level. And I guess I still, as much as I see the way in which the left has definitely like environmental, because everything is so polarized, environmentalism kind of ended up being like a left issue, whereas for a long time the left was just sort of overtly like had an overt animosity towards environmentalism. And then as the situation, like as the crisis has progressed, the left has said like, okay, we're subsuming environmentalism. Like if you care about the ecological crisis, that means you're a leftist now. But the answer, like the right strategy for dealing with the ecological crisis is to do exactly what we were always saying you should do just to be a leftist in general back when we hated environmentalism. And, I think that like what I'm experiencing, as much as there is like a lot more attention on one level within the left to environmental issues, is just exactly that. Like this sense that unless somebody literally has like a sense of wonder about the world that they live in and a sense of humans being like one part of a broad system and that being like a core paradigm that they operate from, I guess I'm starting to really encounter this feeling that they will always come to responses to the ecological crisis that aren't really very good and just kind of don't work. Yeah.
And they'll also ultimately revert to what it is that they are their values.
Exactly.
So the constant tension is like, well, this is one of the things we wrote about way back when in Brightlands, like that the left has to make climate and environmentalism one more area of injustice.
Yeah, exactly.
And not just injustice broadly, but injustice based on what's local.
Right.
So, because that's the value. The value is, what's the injustice here? We don't hear a lot in the left about the global injustice is not the actual if you're just looking at who's screwed here. Even poor people in the U.S. are less screwed than poor people on any island or, Bangladesh, who are going to lose their nation. There's something else you were just saying that was triggering something, but it's escaped me now. The empathetic, the kind of sense of among the various things that have been lost, and I don't know. It was so central to me. I didn't have one crystallizing particular experience. I just cared about a lot of different things, and then I read really just a handful of books, and like, okay, that makes sense. That's the problem, and in fact, I always felt sort of estranged from the people who were emotive. Like, I remember when Earth First was happening, and it wasn't Roselle, I forgot who the other person who...
Like Dave Foreman or somebody.
Yeah, Foreman.
Right.
Came and gave a talk when I was in college in Western Mass, and there's a lot of people, and somewhere in the middle of it, he started talking about his affinity with the wolf, and then he just starts
I know where this is going.
He's like howling.
Yeah, totally.
And everybody else is like, oh, and I'm like, what the fuck? This is, I was like, I don't want any part. I just didn't relate at that time anyway. I still probably could not pull off a howl, but the pain, the sense of pain or connectedness, positively or negatively, I have that. Just and the numbers, so the get-go in any given situation would be, well, how does this? Oh, I'm sorry. If you don't bring that to it, then you're not seeing everything that's happening as being essentially driven in large part by the pathology of our distance from everything else, right? Like that's the problem is that we're no longer part of the world. We've created our own thing, and that's why we're crazy. And we're all crazy.
Right, totally.
Most people, including many leftists, don't think we're crazy.
Yeah.
They just think that some people are more screwed than others, but they don't think that the whole thing is fucked up, except in economic or justice terms, whereas any environmentalist sees all of us as being, it's a pathology of the species, and that we wouldn't be right until we're right with it, until it's painful to us to kill a thing or destroy it. Who was it that was, I think it was Jensen was noting in a Facebook post the other day, I saw, he was like going, the story is about Denmark building some reefs or islands to put the wind generators on. He's like, and everybody thinks that's a good idea. Who's thinking about what that means to the creatures there? What is that? Like, yeah, that's it, right? And so to embrace that is why I appreciate having knowing something of the story of early Christianity, which was absolutely revolutionary in so many ways, but especially at we are all equal under God. We are all equal. That was utterly revolutionary, and yet we were able to, everyone worldwide, pretty much everybody, so our thing of we are or need to be within the broader web of life, all like that. It's possible to do that. It's possible to have those kinds of leap in consciousness, but it's a huge task, and it's nowhere visible now. Nobody's talking about. No. I guess I'll have to go watch the damn movie now. I suspect that the editor of that is not coming from that perspective. I don't know, but
so I was surprised because it's not actually like Michael Moore who made it, right? It's this other guy.
Yeah, the other guy
who does actually seem Jeff Gibbs, and he does seem to actually be coming from an ecological worldview per se. And you should watch it, because one of my core reactions to it, it's like there's all these things about it where I'm like, oh, why'd you guys do that? They definitely they used a bunch of 10-year-old information about renewable energy. So I just thought that the backlash was very the predictable thing that has been so focused on is no, solar panels are more efficient now. And, sure, those were the falsehoods major environmental organizations were trafficking in a decade ago, but now we walk the path of truth, and it's so I can see all these ways that they could have done a much better job, but at the same time, I did really appreciate it, because when I talk to people who haven't been in the political bubbles that I've spent a lot of my life in, and I try to explain why, how it is that I've done all this work and had significant organizational, organized significant things and had momentum, but I just don't have any I don't have a job with an environmental group, and I don't have any real active network or whatever. I try to explain all the barriers that I've encountered, all the things that are just fundamentally wrong with environmental politics as they currently play out. It's just really difficult to convey, and I think the film does on some level just provide a very accessible window into how just how useless most environmental politics are. And so one of the reactions that I had after I watched it was I was thinking that it would have been an amazing tool to organize the green donor strikes that you talked about in the past. I was like, well, they've done a better job of laying out the case for a green donor strike than, you or I ever really got around to, they got millions of views and all that.
Cool. All right. Well, that's good. I'm totally, probably why I wanted to watch it. I was totally jealous.
Right.
Right. Just another one of these things where one documentary
No, I know, yeah.
Can eclipse everything else you could possibly do.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I thought, I definitely...
Except for Lindsay's.
In one permutation of talking about the green donor strike, that notion we had of doing some amazing direct action and claiming credit for it on behalf of all the big greens and forcing them into the dilemma of being like, no, of course not. We're not calling for those policies, and we would never turn off pipelines and blockade trains. I thought that's I like that idea better, but in the world we live in, I guess if you just make a pretty slickly produced documentary and put it on YouTube, millions of people can potentially be on your side all of a sudden. I don't know, but yeah, and I don't know, I think that there's an emerging... I'm going to read the research that you talked about with the forms of intelligence. I think that there's just kind of an emerging science. I've spent all this time reading all this literature on all these corollaries of right-left, even though I don't really personally identify with right-left politics very much at all. There are all these corollaries of right-left political perceptions that give a pretty strong indication that there's an innate basis on some level for orienting towards those positions, and it's all this there's all these kind of unpredictable idiosyncratic covariates brain structure or degrees of fearful responses to the same stimuli and all this stuff, and I very much think that a similar science, I don't think it's anywhere nearly as developed, but I think a similar science could be undertaken with respect to ecological worldviews.
Yeah.
I think there's some...
Well, so the tricky part for me in the first, and that there's innate attraction to a particular ideology, is how does that fit with masses though? Because does that mean that at some points, if a certain perspective becomes dominant, do other people just switch or go? Right. Something has to go in or hurt. And I'm constantly thinking about this in ways of, one of them is I'm looking at the places in the Midwest that 100 years ago, the young men went off to die in large numbers, in order to end slavery. I don't care what anybody else is saying. That's why some of them went because they had to, but a lot of them were going to end slavery. Those are the same places that are now flying Confederate flags. Yeah. So you've had, is it, that's why I'm sort of more, I think more attracted to the idea of the Gardner type thing, where it's a type of how you process the world. The substance can be wildly different. It could depend on circumstance and that within humanity overall, there clearly is a spectrum, both individual, but also in a social group, of our willingness to be mean.
Right.
What's our willingness to be mean at any given point? Germans sometimes are, sometimes, we've got this shift happening there where it doesn't really fit with, it's a bigger question, or it's a macro shifting, somehow whatever happens at the small groups within the overall society, how do each of them contribute or in any way help shape where we go or how we understand things. At some point, it can either click in. So to me, if I'm sitting here trying to figure out where, from my own experience of all the things we've been talking about, watching what's happening, conflict inside XR, the response to this movie, I feel like I'm ultimately wanting to argue for essentially liberalism, right? I think we need liberalism. The good part, or the core part of liberalism, or libertarianism, like they would call it in Europe, is the understanding that people are different. People, we need to find things that bind us together, focus on those, and we should leave everybody alone. Be different if they want to be different. Like, that's liberalism to me. So that's being clearly lost on the right, where there's an orthodoxy, and now we're creating our own, or the left has its own orthodoxy. So where's the room? That's one of the things that XR tried pretty hard to carve space for. Like, what we can have a community of people that just disagrees on a bunch of stuff, and yet we're still here. We're still like that. So that loss of civility or loss of liberality, loss of the ability, I think, to be expressive of your own innate, whatever those things are, that, like, it's not bad to have some people who tend towards the authoritarian, if you can also have other people who tend towards the anarchist and can have a useful, but see broadly what we're trying to do. Anyway, I feel like I need to argue for, if I want to be trying to do anything at this point, it has to be to go to a level I don't think of myself as having any interest or facility for, but to talk about values and to talk about the environmental values and the need for have that as I don't know what to say about Al Gore, because he wrote about it. I think he's in the Klein category if he wrote about it, but he doesn't feel it. But when he wrote about it as central organizing principles, like, that's what we need to do. But we also have to, hold fast to the value of liberality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I see it kind of similarly in the way that I talk about it, is the sense that as our societies have, like, I do think that, as our societies have progressed in social and technological complexity, I guess you could say, there's all these capacities that develop for hyper-differentiated, increasingly specialized forms of self-expression. And, this is true on any number of levels. Like, obviously, as societies get more complex, people's, for instance, occupations become, they fall into more and more narrow niches, right? Or, science, as it expands and becomes more complex, scientists are forced to not know anything about most of science at large and to hyper specialize in one particular domain of inquiry. And I think that this is also just really true, in terms of the, whatever incredibly, fascinating, complex, landscape of, sort of innate cognitive differences comprise our species as we get more complex. Whatever kind of tendencies are particularly pronounced in you, you end up becoming less of a cohesive entity that encompasses all the other tendencies that we all, I feel like we all sort of possess some version of these same traits, but they're just more or less pronounced in different people. So you end up kind of hyper specializing, and increasingly, especially, the internet made a huge leap for the human species in being able to inhabit your unique frame of reference with just the other people who share your cognitive biases. But I think the processes have been going on for a long time. I think the emergence of the right-left divide, for instance, it only comes about after certain capacities for uniquely differentiated self-expression come about in a society. It's not there in really traditional societies. And so I think that that's one way to think about it. All these differences that are becoming increasingly severe forms of conflict, I think there is ultimately they have a sort of technological corollary on some level. There's some way in which it's just a result of our capacity for complexity. And then I see if I'm if humans are going to survive, if the world is going to survive, there's got to be some way that we're oh, okay, that's cool, that's really interesting. We've mapped out all these differences in our minds. The internet on some level is a map of all our different sort of cognitive tendencies, but now that we've done that, the path to survival is one of transcending the hyper differentiation and transcending and being able to, yeah, exactly, to inhabit those and to inhabit our unique perspectives and to give expression to them and do interesting things with them, but to also be able to have some level of empathy in coordination with and just sort of like basic accord with people who have other perceptual, biases. And we'll see if that's what happens.
All right, let's get going on that, man. Yeah.
I feel like we're up against a few limitations. I do have somewhere I have to be, and also we've recorded about as much material as I should probably put out into one podcast. Okay. And I honestly don't feel like we're done. I have this, there's a bunch of other things that I wanted to talk about that we just didn't get to. So I don't know. I enjoyed this. Maybe we should just keep talking at some point in the future.
Always enjoy, well, for one thing, there aren't that many people I have, shared, enough shared. So it gets interesting to explore the others. My conversations, as probably yours are, mostly are just trying to explain some of this.
Yeah, right.
Like, here's one way to, So thank you for the invitation.
What did you say?
I said thank you for the invitation. I'm going to go back out and work on my next bed.
Keep gardening.
Gopher-proof bed. In theory.
Right, because, we're all one, and we have a fundamental empathy with all beings, but fuck those gophers.
Exactly. Gophers, yeah.
All right, on that note, it was great to talk to you.
Take care. You too.
Take care.